Hello and welcome to this World Built Environment Forum webinar series. My name is Andrew Knight, and today's webinar will be discussing digital facilities management, measuring social performance. Over the next hour or so, we'll be discussing the role of FM with respect to social performance, how we drive and measure it when managing buildings, who's responsible and accountable, and what kind of data and skills do we need. So without further ado, let me introduce our panel. So Savannah, could you join us and give us an introduction to yourself and Built ID, if you would?
Hi there, I'm Savannah de Savary. I'm the founder and CEO of Built ID. We're a digital platform for occupier and community engagement, trying to empower communities to have more meaningful dialogue with decision makers and really drive the constructive behaviour and relationships.
Thanks, Savannah. And Chris Jeffers, do please join us.
Thank you, Andrew. Hello, everyone. So my name is Chris Jeffers. I'm the Facilities Management Consultancy Lead at Mott MacDonald. One of the main areas of interest for me in this is particularly when we support and advise customers to make sure that the social value aspects of the work that they're doing are incorporated into whatever projects we're supporting. I think it's something that needs a lot more of a sort of noisy platform for the future. So really interested in the conversation forthcoming.
Thanks, Chris. And as ever, last but not least, Mark Tyson.
Hello, everybody. So I work for Legal and General Investment Management. We are the landlord, if you like, to use an old-fashioned term, for a number of properties in the UK. And we take investors' money, and we obviously have to make returns in various sectors, be that hotels, offices, build-to-rent, residential, retail, you name it, we've got it. And my role within that is to look after our property management teams, facilities management, supply chain, and digital technology and change.
Thanks, Mark. Well, for those of you listening and viewing today, we really welcome your active involvement. So please do submit questions to our panel, as it really helps to bring the conversation to life. If you're new to these webinars, you should see that you can submit questions at any time using the question box on your screen that'll come up on my screen. So we'll pick up as many as we can go throughout the session. So please do get involved and give us some questions that we can pose to the panel. So I guess really starting first, and perhaps if I could ask you, Savannah, I'd be intrigued to get your view on, in this post-pandemic world we're in, the changes in working patterns for office workers. To what extent do you think asset owners, building and property managers and occupiers are actually placing greater emphasis on the S in ESG?
I think in terms of the office workers and the occupiers, I think they are already playing a much greater emphasis on the S. I think in terms of actually maybe the property managers and I think in asset owners, I think it's lagging a little bit behind. I think that we're maybe 12 to 18 months away from when the priority moves from the E, which everyone by then will really have got to grips with, and suddenly we're focusing on the S. And we expect the technologies and the tools to already be there, ready to be deployed to really track this. I think we still have a way to go in terms of the focus on it, but that's not the case for the occupiers. You know, the pandemic, I think, caused a permanent shift in terms of how much value and priority we place on well-being and wellness. And if we're going to leave our homes to go somewhere, we really want to be able to see a sort of return on investment in terms of how it makes us feel.
So Chris, if moving to you, are you seeing that similar kind of bottom-up approach where the drive is almost coming from, or the focus is coming from the occupier?
I think it's a really good point. I think I completely agree with Savannah that we're not quite there in terms of the evidence around measuring. I think the focus has been on the E. We are seeing quite a bit of more movement in terms of the occupier pushing the S, if you like, of the ESG. I still think there's quite a long way to go. I think it's interesting. I was at a meeting, conference not so long ago, where one of the attendees mentioned that, well, hang on, we've been talking about this for 20 years, it's all CSR, even more. I think it's an interesting point because I can see that perspective. I think it's dangerous in this, in the light of what we're talking about here, because this is slightly different. This is much more about people, and I think hopefully we're going to come on to talk about that in the context of what we actually mean by the social side of it. It's much more about the empathy for people and about how we, through all of the work activities that we do, whatever role we have, we focus on the well-being of those people. And that's the bit that I think is not quite there yet in terms of the measurement. So yes, I think there is a greater emphasis being placed on it. I think we are, I know it's a cliche, but we're sort of on a journey in terms of being able to really evidence that at this point.
Thanks, Chris. Now, Mark, I was very mindful you used, as you described yourself, that kind of slightly old-fashioned word landlord. And I guess from your perspective as a landlord, that sort of, dare I say it, sort of old-fashioned feudal world, how are you seeing this?
Yeah, I think the big shift, there's a couple of shifts from my perspective post-COVID. Clearly, everybody's read in the paper about the offices take up. I mean, it often gets said, but really premium offices are still people want. They want flexibility. They don't want 20-year leases anymore. People will pay a premium for good quality office space. I think that's been proven. I think the UK problem we've got is there's a lot of substandard office environments which don't help you with your E, which drives you into a conversation about what you're going to do at that board level. So I think occupier behaviour is much more focused around people rather than the commercials, strangely, which I'll come back to in a second because that has an interesting connotation further down the chain. But what we're seeing now is a much more open-minded view in where they're going to put their people. So the organisations, they take a lot longer time. Their HR teams are much more involved. They even have surveys with their teams to understand what they might like. And I think the challenge for the landlord is to become more of a partner, much more open and transparent in terms of creating experience in these assets, which are quite unique, which I think when we come to talk about the S is a really interesting thing for me. Because if I look at pre-pandemic, it's a classic issue for an institutional investor like us, is you end up with a lot of homogenous product. So you could walk into a lot of our offices in the UK 5 years ago and they look very similar. The service would be very similar. And I think what we've learned is over the years is to, accelerated by COVID, is to really listen to our occupiers and create spaces and amenity which the people in the buildings want to use, and in turn becomes a USP for us in the market for people to come into the building. So yeah, that's a big change. The other change that's coming up and hasn't quite flown through yet is more awareness of what facilities managers do through COVID and the challenges within that, and simple things like cleaning and security that were very much taken for granted beforehand. I think the people in our buildings have much more rapport and an understanding of wage levels, treatment. Modern slavery is obviously a key topic in a number of areas of facilities management. So I think we've got an awareness bottom up in terms of treating people in a better way, which is welcome post-COVID, but also a top-down view that when we're choosing space, people are much more picky, and there's a number of things they want to try and do. And social value is one of those areas where you're going to spend the same amount of money often in different buildings. You want to be quite comfortable talking to your team about how that pound of rent you're paying is contributing either to the wider net zero carbon agenda or to the local community that you're based within, which is probably a theme we'll come back to later on.
Indeed, thanks, Mark. I'm conscious we've kind of launched into this fascinating subject without perhaps giving the audience a bit of a, when I say brief, but hopefully a succinct definition of what we think the S in ESG means for FM. I mean, Mark, how would you define in as fewer words as possible what you think social value means for FM?
Yeah, I think as part of the battle, right, it's a very broad topic, but we're doing this with our funds at the moment, being quite, I think the word we're using is meaningful with social impact. And this is things like where you're infecting jobs and skills, where you're trying to work with charitable foundations to make things happen. Regeneration comes into this as well in terms of how we develop and build things out. And there's a whole number of categories which social value gets drawn into. But I think the challenge around that is, and we'll definitely talk about this, is measurement, and also then doing something that if you hadn't done it as an organisation wouldn't have happened anyway. That's the way I look at social value. It's like, it's easy to say you've ticked a few boxes on a matrix. Everything's a matrix these days. But ultimately, social value is, have you done something meaningful in one of those categories around jobs creation or supporting a charity or a cause, which if you hadn't been involved as an organisation may not have happened. That's that intentional piece.
Thanks. And Chris, what would be your quick sort of elevator pitch definition of social value from an FM perspective?
Yeah, I think very much building on what Mark has said, it's about making a positive impact. It's about making positive difference on the communities to which whatever the work is involved in, that they impact, not just the people that are actually employed or the sort of direct end users, but the wider communities in that, whether that's a project that's building something, doesn't matter what it is, big major infrastructure, and that something comes out of that, playing fields, sports pitches, etc., that are then invested in by the people involved in that project, that obviously positively impact the community that is in that area. So it's a good way that Mark's defined it there about making a difference and doing something that wouldn't have happened anyway, that, as I say, has that positive difference.
And Savannah, what's your definition?
I would agree, and I'd even simplify it further and say it's about your impact on people, essentially. And I think people get quite wrapped up in what is social value, what is delivering social value, and it can be so diverse because it's about aligning what you do with the preferences and priorities and needs of the people impacted by your work. And as Chris and Mark both rightly said, that's the wider community as well as your tenant community, the people who work for you, with you. And I think people think of it as very distinct from the E of ESG, when actually, so my company has spoken to hundreds of thousands of diverse community members. Our real focus is on those hard to reach demographics and trying to activate them and getting them to engage with decision makers meaningfully. And what's interesting is one of their top priorities is sustainability. It's about what world will the future inherit, and actually that means there's social value also in doing environmental initiatives, not just for the planet but also for people and what their priorities are. I see it as actually quite integrated, the two, just because if it's shifted, and if you're working in a community where that's not their priority, it no longer adds a social value. It's very situational what's going to have that positive impact. It completely depends on the demographics and what they need.
Chris, moving to you.
That's brilliant, Savannah. I think that's absolutely right. Yeah.
Thanks. Chris, moving to you.
Just quickly add to that, Andrew. Sorry, I just want to quickly add to that very quickly that's a really good point about sustainability impact, because this is about being sustainable for the future, and that's also about, and I'll go on about it, I know, but it's also about the people involved too, about sustainable business practice that ensures that those resources, those skilled, trained, motivated resources are there for that business to be able to be successful in the future. It's a hugely important area. Sorry, please take on.
Thanks, Chris. No, I was going to move to you actually and ask you around, given that the kind of multiple stakeholders that can be involved in even quite the most simple asset, the owners themselves, occupiers, property building managers, FM operators, where does this responsibility lie, and how do you get that kind of collaboration to work when you've got so many stakeholders in real estate involved in delivering, a building in all its dimensions?
Yes. Yeah, we've mentioned, We've mentioned a couple of times about the bottom-up approach. I think very much hand in hand with that is that leadership is absolutely essential to this. It's absolutely key to it, and that's easy to say. It's not necessarily always easy to actually put into effect. It has to come as a key, clear strategic objective for whatever the work is, and whatever the project is. Whatever the business deliverable is. So I think the alignment of strategic objectives is very important. You set out at the beginning of whatever it is you're doing, drawing a line if it's an ongoing project or an ongoing piece of work, and saying how do we therefore focus on the S of the ESG, or if you're delivering a big project, right at the beginning of that project you say how are we going to deliver on these objectives. And so I think it's whoever those people are that are leading that project, they have to make sure that this is prioritized and focused on, not just at the beginning, and Mark mentioned about the tick box exercise, and I couldn't agree more, it just cannot be that, otherwise it kind of automatically fails. You have to have something that can continue through the life of the project, the built asset, and can be measured and monitored and assessed through that through those years, presumably, in terms of the life of whatever the built asset is. So I suppose to try and summarize that up, it's the leadership piece. You've got to have alignment of objectives to make sure that collaboration happens.
Thanks. And moving to you, Mark, obviously you perhaps have if I can use that phrase, top-down view as the asset owner. How do you kind of marshal these various stakeholders to deliver what you want?
Yeah, there's some really interesting things there. I think I was just reflecting. So I think the S for us has always been quite difficult. We focused on the E because we said it earlier on, it's measurable, it galvanizes people. I think what I've learned in the last 6 months and what we've done now is we need to get a mixture of themes, which are like a strategic themes, which then overlap with a regional story. Because I'll give you an example of that, right? So we've got hundreds of people across the UK working on our buildings every day, and they're all doing great, lots of micro things, but they don't really join up into a theme. Therefore, it either gets very isolated or it doesn't happen. right? Second thing is, I was in a pitch the other day, and unfortunately an FM company put up on the wall, we've got this partnership with a prison in Wales, and I was like, that's brilliant. How's that going to help our site in Newcastle? You know, so there's this danger that you get into these conversations where, and this is where somebody said about CSR. I think the big difference with CSR, if I was being really blunt, was 10, 15 years ago, it was about, as an organisation, demonstrating the small bits that you were doing across the UK or the world, which were adding value beyond financial gain, right? So there was lots of glossy reports talking about case studies. I think where we're moving to is being able to demonstrate as an organisation where you are meaningfully at scale, if you are at scale, like we are, something that wouldn't have happened without us. I keep repeating that because I think that's probably my big thing here. Lots of people can do lots of good stuff in isolation. That's not the problem here. The problem is, how do you move the dial in a big way? So I think the way we look at it is, going back to that thematic thing, we're now challenging our funds to say, stop saying to your operational teams, we want to achieve 12 different things. Say to them 2 or 3 things that are really important to you. So one of them could be jobs and skills in Cardiff, right? So as a fund, how do we work together with other funds or other partners in Cardiff to really make a difference around disability back to work or something like that? So it becomes something that everybody further down the chain can go, right, Legal and General in Cardiff, when we're pitching for work or when we're doing stuff, really want to make a difference over a longer period of time around disability at work. Do you see what I mean? So that's where I think the top-down approach really adds value, a bit more clarity, to Chris's point as well, around what we are trying to achieve. And the nice thing about pension is we can take a long-term view, right? So we can take a 10 to 15-year view on what Cardiff might look like with the council. And that's where I think we add value to the situation, providing that clarity and some guidance then for suppliers to say, right, to support your objective in this area, this is what we're going to do.
Thanks, Mark. I mean, Savannah, moving to you, how do you see this challenge of getting these different moving parts, these different stakeholders to effectively add value by aligning and working together rather than perhaps working against each other, as it were, or certainly with a lack of coordination?
Yeah, I agree with everything that Chris and Mark said, and I think I'll pick up on something that Mark just said there, which I think is quite important, which is he said, then when we're going, let's say, and pitching for work in that particular place, we have something, you know, a holistic narrative to point to. I think we try and separate out social value from commercial objectives. And I think that's a mistake, because it means you then have some stakeholders who are rolling their eyes saying, we're trying to run a business here, we're not a charity. You know, we give to charity, we're not a charity, and you have that separated out from actually the commercial objectives, and I think that's a mistake. You know, we're a B Corp, and we're an ESG tech company essentially. But what actually I find is most powerful is what we do is social value is a byproduct of using our platform. You could use it to try and get planning permission, or you could use it to try and, you know, increase tenant renewals. How are you doing that? How are you getting that community buy-in? It's because you're delivering social value. So I think that's really part of this needs to be is if you want to get the stakeholders joined up, and I think there is a lot of disconnect still, it's actually about not shying away from occupiers on you know, sort of they're not dim, right? They know you have commercial objectives for doing this, and there's no harm in it. You know, there's great insurance tech companies out there that have this amazing gamification and these great features for trying to improve your well-being, your mental and physical health. That has an amazing social value impact, but actually they're doing it because it means there's going to be less claims on the insurance, right? Because you're going to be in better shape and have to go to the doctor less. And I think we need to turn that corner to get away from, let's be honest, that slight eye roll you always get from one stakeholder in the room who says, we're not a charity, we're trying to run a business. Let's align the commercial objectives with actually the social value that good business delivers. And I think then we'll get them joined up.
Thanks.
Andrew, could I come in on that?
Yeah, of course.
If appropriate. Yeah, so I think actually that is a really good way of explaining it. And an example I draw to is, we kicked off a campaign December last year called Hidden Workers, and that was about bringing some health inequality issues to the table, and particularly around sick pay in summary. And the fascination around that for me was, it didn't take me that long to persuade Legal and General Board to back it, which I think was fantastic. But then the challenges I've had to get the commercials to line up, because everyone's like, that's great, Mark. Of course, we'd love our cleaners to have sick pay, but we can't afford it. And then when you go through the process and you realise that actually it's an extra 1 or 2% a year to provide sick pay to your teams, and obviously that's a huge long-term benefit to the UK economy because we're getting people to go to the doctor earlier. We're reducing the cost of the NHS. We're keeping people in work longer. We've got this huge, I think it's 2 million people in the UK that are out of work for health reasons, right? So you start looking at the macro here and you say, right, this is an area we really need to deal with. But it's fascinating. And I know there's a lot of facilities management people on this call, which is one of the reasons why I wanted to join it. It's the resistance from the facilities management group to put that stuff on the table, because for years and years and years, customers have been so cost conscious that, to your point, Savannah, we're not a charity. Yeah, it's lovely we want to give these people sick pay, but that is, for me, a great example of where social value needs to become commercial, because I think it needs to get to a point where, like the living wage has, a real living wage, that it's just not acceptable in modern UK to have people going to work worrying about whether or not they're going to get paid if they get really sick. So you've got to get the stakeholders, to Savannah's point, to really line up, not just on the, this is a great idea, which is a 2-minute conversation. It's, do the commercials align between the various organisations in terms of customer, FM supply chain, the individuals, to really deliver that in a meaningful way? And that's probably my best example that I've been working on really closely for the last 6 or 7 months. But yeah.
Thanks, Mark. Chris, you've got some comments.
Yeah, just to add to that is absolutely an area of work that myself and my team, and I'm sure other consultancies are also doing this too, but we're looking at the commercial impact of not doing it and trying to explain that. And what I mean, simply what I mean is basically, if you do take a very dispassionate and isolationist, sort of financially driven, I'm starting to show my prejudice here, but you know what I mean, in terms of it's just money, in terms of we're just looking at it from a cash flow or a P&L perspective, we can't afford it. Okay, fine, you've made that decision. So therefore, what is the long-term effect of the people who will be impacted by that to the business over the next 5, 10, 15 years? The cost of recruitment, the cost of not having somebody there, the cost of having to pay agencies in terms of the the bodies that need to come in to replace the direct labour. So we're trying to do some work in that now to look at the potential, estimated calculation of what that might look like, to make sure that there is a clear business case for doing the right thing. Because I think it's easy to say, well, we should do this, but just to pick up, I think both the panel members have also said it, you've got to have the alignment of the commercial case too. You can't have the two isolated, because unfortunately, my experience, money will always trump it, and we've got to get around that, because there is a fundamental underlying problem with the sorry but we can't afford it issue, and so we need to be able to articulate that, and that's what we need to do a bit more of, in terms of forensically deep diving into the numbers and saying, all right, well, what does that actually look like then to the impact on this business, on our business, on our customers' business, on the businesses in the local community? And that's what we're trying to do. It's not easy, but I think it's really important to try and do that. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. Mark, back to you, if I may. And you talked about, obviously, the benefit you have of taking quite a long-term view on your assets. And I was also interested earlier about your comment about almost the local context sometimes of initiatives. So from your point of view, when you're sort of asking the question, what does a great social building look like and how can we best get there? Are you thinking about a mix of kind of almost macro level things? We've just discussed the sick pay issue and the number of people are off work in that sense. And is it a mix of kind of macro issues and then localization? And, do you have different methodologies almost for different assets in that way?
Yeah, great question. Great question. Right, let me try and answer this in a way that makes sense. So basically, the strategy, so we've got 42 multi-let offices across the UK, right, of various sizes. And the strategy that we started 4.5 years ago was each of those 42 assets needs to act like its own brand. So as a building user walking through the door, you don't really know it's operated by L&G. You want to be in Hodge House in Cardiff or Apex in Reading or 150 Gardens in Manchester. And what we had to do is move from quite a sterile environment where everyone was waiting to be told what to do to, and the word I'm going to use here a couple of times is culture, where we had great people in our buildings that had barriers and governance to work within, because clearly health and safety never goes away. There is a budget and all that lovely stuff. But getting great people in those spaces changes the game. And honestly, I cannot explain to you, like those 3 buildings I mentioned, when I walk through the door, you just know it's an amazing place. Like we have QR codes on the posters that are anonymous, which used to drive people mad, but people love now because it's just in the good buildings. And I'm not pretending we haven't got issues in some buildings, but in the good buildings, it's just literally week after week of, oh, I love this person and I love that event you ran, and can we have that charity back in again? Because what we've done is we've created the space and given people permission to go and build relationships with the community, bring on supply chain that as long as they meet a minimum criteria that we will try and accommodate, and then work with occupiers at a human level to understand what they want. Now, as long as they can fit within our framework of being safe, clearly there's other governance issues that we have. That's our strategy, and it's hard. Like that was hard, but we've got it now. And I think that what I see now just blows my mind, because there's a bit of technology in that which we might come to later on, and Savannah's obviously got some cool ideas on technology as well, but it's then how you use the technology to amplify it. So if you've got a good idea in one place that really worked, how do we share that somewhere else? And then using sort of core themes. And another example I give of that is, so we partner with a company called Globe Chain, who are like an eBay for business. And you can put on like a load of pallets that you don't need anymore, or old computers or old desks, and there's hundreds of charities across the UK just waiting for stuff to drop, and they'll take it. You've stopped it going to landfill, you've given a charity vital equipment potentially to run their business, and it's all done at the touch of a button. Yeah, so we've launched that across, I think, about 300 properties now, including industrial estates and retail parks. And that's an example of where, to your point there, Andrew, macro strategy is, how do we have a reuse exchange, we call it, that helps all of our occupiers in terms of recycling and reusing, versus a local culture that says, we know best what the charities are in the local area. We know what our occupiers want in that building. And it's that mixed bag, which I think has made our buildings quite vibrant over the last couple of years.
Thanks, Mark. I mean, Savannah, what's your view on this question of what does a great social building look like, and you know, what are the best methodologies of getting there?
Yeah, I mean, I think having that holistic strategy, like Mark said, is so important, and then making it situational. I would take a step back and say, what does a great social building look like? It depends what you're starting with and how can it best be achieved. Because we work quite a lot with, sort of like council estates, right? And when you're working with social housing, what a great building looks like, social building from that perspective, is make it safe in terms of the CCTV and the street lighting for them to get from their car to their front door. Make the public realm space. It's not lots of beautiful tree planting and lovely lush spaces, not because they don't want those and value them, but what the community says back to us, that occupied community, is we don't feel safe in those spaces. We need something practical of our public realm space. We need it to be an outdoor gym, or we need it to be sort of a play facility, but something where we can really have a productive use of this space to stop people loitering there. So what a great social building looks like there, and how it can best be achieved. You're starting from a different point to if you're working on a build to rent asset, where I think having a great social building there has to come into you bringing the outside community in as well, making them feel involved, bringing those assets together, looking at it in that localized level holistically, how you fit into that wider environment and the spaces there. I'm a big believer in like micro placemaking, because placemaking, let's be honest, now it's just it's a new word for gentrification. But actually, if you can do micro, which is probably not a very popular thing to say, but it is, that's how communities see it. But if you can do within a building, if you can make that a place and bring the wider community in and see how it can interact, it can be really powerful. I also think the best way it can be achieved is actually not the most expensive way. Often it can be, okay, we have meeting rooms, we have their technology, the data to see that they're being underutilized at X hours on X days. Let's open it up to our building to see how actually, what are the local social initiatives, the local charities that actually could benefit from having this space for free once every Thursday or whatever it may be. And whenever our clients ask those sort of questions to a community, you get such an outpouring of really constructive feedback from incredible local initiatives that would bite your arm off for that space. But by actually integrating your occupiers and helping make that decision, you're able to actually, I think, best achieve that social building, bringing that community together. Like Mark said when he was talking about the sort of feedback they get with their QR codes, we loved having this charity event, we loved having that, actually bring people together. That's what placemaking should be, and you can do that within a single facility. You don't need to be doing a master plan to do that. In fact, that's not good placemaking if it's actually excluding it, communities already there. It's how do you integrate it.
So Chris, moving to you, it feels like that it's a mix of the macro, community level, asset specific issues. What's your sense of these almost multiple versions of what good looks like?
Sure, I think really comprehensive answers there, and I agree with all of that. I think for me, the this is a really good example, a really good area where the people to the people process and technology really comes out. I think there isn't really, not in my view anyway, a particular design or blueprint for a good or a great social building in terms of design. It's much more about how that building is managed, and do the people who manage that building or manage the people in that building, do they understand the needs of the people who interact with that building? What have they actually done to go out there and find out how those needs have developed and moved on? Because buildings are predominantly designed to a set of standards, regulations, guidelines, etc. And they just cannot keep up with the way in which people want to be able to use space. So yes, you can design in flexibility in terms of the actual structures or the services that support a building. I think this is a lot more than that. I think this is much more about what both Mark and Savannah have been mentioning there, about how do we actually reach out to communities so that buildings we're talking about could become much more sort of social, in a bit of a cliche, but sort of social hubs, and those focus for whatever the communities are doing. And by the way, the other thing I've noticed, I started out in property management, mainly in commercial, about 26 years ago. We have moved on hugely since then in terms of the areas that we're talking about now. So I think we are in a much better place. But I think this is also an area where there are certain aspects of the S that cannot be necessarily responded to in terms of a structure or a building. Neurodiversity for one of them, and accessibility. Accessibility can be responded to and in effect measured, if you like, in terms of what's delivered by the DDA and MPACs, but not so much neurodiversity. That has to come from the people who are responsible for that space, responding to the needs of the people who are in it or are likely to be in it at any one point. And that again is very much about the human element, the human need. So I think just perhaps the second bit of this in terms of how it can best be achieved, it is about whoever's responsible for managing whatever the space is to understand the needs and the wider needs of what's in the community. And I think it's really important that, again, I'll go back to the leadership of or the leadership aspect of this, is that they give time to the people who are responsible to do that. So if we're talking about FMs or property managers, give them the time to go out there. In fact, make it even a deliverable for them, make them responsible for it. Go out and find out what you can do to improve those community relations so that we really do focus on the S, as I say.
Thanks. Well, but before I move to the next question on our agenda, I've got a question from the floor that I'd like to ask all of you your opinion on, and it's from Lucy Stone, who says, how do you manage the governance of local initiatives using the spare office space? You know, problems with health and safety, security usually hinder most clients from doing this. Mark, maybe move to you on that as a challenge in terms of allowing these buildings to have access from the local community.
Yeah, I mean, I think our standout, if you were looking at a model of what a social value building is, and I'll be crucified for not mentioning this one, it's 245 Hammersmith, and anybody around that way wants to go have a look. I'm sure Carly, our general manager, senior person down there, would help show you around. But when you say that question, it brings me to mind, because again, that's an example of giving some autonomy. She's brought in all sorts of charities into our empty floor plate. I remember going down there 6 months ago, and she had this charity that deals with lots of homeschool children, and they offer the ability for people to come in and do some play in structured groups and like sort of just change it up a bit. And you walk through this Cat A fit out, and there's literally just silver floor. You all know what it's like, and just toys everywhere and children laughing and joking. And I was like, you know what? If she'd followed the rules, that wouldn't have happened. But you know what? She has followed the rules to the point of security and health and safety, because everyone was signed in, everyone was given a little briefing, fire alarm, and all that lovely stuff. But she understands how the heartbeat of that asset benefits the community, and she makes the rules work for her. So everything anybody else asks me on this point comes back to people and culture. If you've got people in your buildings that understand the strategy of the business, the rules of the game, and you trust them, they will do amazing things. I love what Chris said there. Actually, we do give people objectives every year to come up with things that we would never have thought about centrally. It's very dangerous for me sitting in an office in London every day thinking about things. You really need to have these people coming up with ideas, and they need to be validated and checked and all that lovely stuff. But we really push that as a part of their annual objectives. But ultimately, you can use empty space like that. You can't offer that on a 12, 24-month lease, but you can do temporary space, temporary arrangements. And as I keep saying to our teams, in some of our buildings which are quite big, you're always going to have an element of void. That charity aren't going to care if they're on floor 2 this week and floor 8 next month. You know, I think that it's that imagination to go and build those relationships and make things work for both parties. So yeah, I think we're better at that. I think there's more to do, but I think that is possible to get around.
Chris or Savannah, any thoughts on that question?
Yeah, I'd add on to that I know in some buildings you have to have the higher security. It can be a challenge, and I think that's when you can get creative. I think this is where technology also comes in and helps. If you have, you know, I'm not in my office today. I was too far away from my own office, so I booked a meeting space. I had to go through all the checks, but if you've asked the community to submit suggestions of great local social initiatives that you want to be able to support, actually some of them will be, yes, using a meeting room would be brilliant, and that's where if you have the right office management platform, that's pretty easy to regulate, same as any other guest. However, there's also ways that it could be, okay, we have a big lobby space with some breakout area. Is it that the third Thursday of every month, that seems to be a day when you have a lot of traffic, or maybe you want to increase the traffic in terms of occupiers coming through, and you ask if they want a local artisan showcase, or do they want local charities to be able to go do that? This is something that I was, visiting a hospital the other week, and they had that going on of local charities. And so, there's a lot of ways that you can actually incorporate them in. Is it actually using local suppliers and asking the community around that? So if you do have those security risks that you can't get around, and the health and safety, there are other ways that you can do it. Or any sort of big building that has an event space, that's another way to be able to open it up and like I said, to integrate it with your occupiers as well. They can sponsor the charity that they want to be coming in and hosting for free there.
Thanks. Perhaps if I can stay with you, Savannah, now. I'm keen to kind of explore, and obviously this relates not just to the S in ESG, but with the increasing digitization of FM, what are the sort of key skills that you're seeing that the FM managers are having to take on board now? Because obviously, the whole world is becoming more digitized, and FM, like so many parts of the built environment, is on the kind of not the leading edge necessarily, but is really being challenged to use technology in a better and more productive way. So what's that evolving skill set look like from your perspective?
Yeah, I think the biggest skills needed and the biggest challenge probably on the other hand of that is actually data analytics. You can gather as much data as you want, but if you don't know how to analyze it, then it's useless. Its value is only in the way you can analyze it. And that's where I think it's not so much that you need to become a data scientist. It's about having those tools like DeepKey. There's ones that pull all this data together for you, and really just actually wanting to drive value from it, wanting to make data-driven decisions. I think that's really where the power comes in. You don't have to have coding skills. You don't have to have, like I said, even that deep analytics for the quantitative analysis. The technologies are there to do all that for you. You just have to have the appetite to really want to learn from it. And I think the other thing is the skill is it can't be that you just bring someone in who sets it all up for you. Because for me, it's about you need to be monitoring this data at the very least on a quarterly basis, so you can learn and you can iterate based on how the tenant satisfaction and insight coming back in fluctuates. So I think that's the big one, is really just it's not necessarily a new technical skill you need, it's to educate yourself around the right platforms to have, and to then make sure that you're getting the most out of them, because technology only takes you so far.
So Chris, I mean, given the question I've just posed to Savannah, do you think it's as much behaviours as skills? Because I think Savannah was almost intimating it's kind of a behavioural issue about using data, thinking about data in a different way, rather than a sort of technical skill in that way.
Exactly that. I think this is an area that anyone who's been involved in FM for a few years now, we realise that we need to be better at it. However you define better, we just need to be able to be more adept at getting the outputs from the analysis of data than we are. I think the tools, you'll hear this on any of these sorts of webinars and these sorts of chats, the tools that actually collate and collect data have been around for years and are doing so now. The data that we have is enormous. We've got a huge amount of data, but it's how do you actually analyze that? So I think it does come back to or indeed, why do you analyze that? What's the reason behind it? So it does come back to behaviors, absolutely. We do need to be better technically, I think, and more advanced and more skilled technically, but there are others that we can lean on to do that. And I think, again, it comes to the heart of what facilities management really is. We are an industry of a very broad range of skills and services. The purpose and the point of FM is to manage all of those. And I see the data that comes from any of these analyses, and so looking at whether it's social value or whether it's your maintenance and energy programs. That's the key skill here, is to actually understand, how do I make effective decisions, take effective decisions using the data that's coming from this. It is more about behaviours and culture rather than the technical side of it. And it's something that I think at the moment we need to focus on as an industry. I think we're not there as an industry, and I think we need to be better at it.
Thanks, Chris. What's your take on this sort of skills, behaviour issue or theme for FM people?
For me, I always look at facilities managers at their best in a time of crisis, and I think COVID points that they're often very good communicators, very good problem solvers. And strangely, it doesn't lend itself to forward planning and analytics. So you're in a situation where you're trying to move an industry forward, which if they didn't do the crisis management, we'd have problems, because actually that genuinely is when you really learn what your FM team does. To bring in to sort of what Chris is saying there, the skills and the specialisms to make better decisions, and that's what we spent a lot of time. Like, you've got dashboards coming out your ears on our account, balanced scorecards, all sorts, but ultimately trying to coach the guys to feel comfortable making decisions and learning from it quite quickly if it wasn't the right decision. And working with occupiers. Air quality is a great example of that. I see someone's put in the chat about lighting. I very much see our buildings being run like an F1 team in the future. Like, you will have people off site that are specialists toggling around with numbers, data scientists, as Savannah mentions. But if it doesn't come through into very clear, you could make decision A, you could make decision B. The energy saving decision B is A, is X, and the energy and the human impact on this decision is Y. What do you want to do? That's where I think we've got to get it to. I think trying to expect facilities managers to be swimming in the analytics, using the reports in depth is unlikely, because ultimately we're asking, we talk about building cultures, building communities. That's a people-based role, all the way through to technical, which is heavily detailed and knowledge-based. So you really want those FMs to play in the middle, and you've got to give them good tools to help make decisions, is my view. We've made good progress on that. But I do think there's also a cultural piece here, which, I mean, if we had time, we could go into for hours, in terms of, for me, I'm going to say there's a subservience sometimes of facilities managers in terms of property managers, occupiers, all that lovely stuff. And it's trying to move the culture on a little bit to say, do you know what, these guys are an equal partner, and all the decisions we have to make around facilities management have a massive impact on the occupier experience, on the rental collection, on letting void units. Like, everything is interrelated. So we've done quite a lot of work trying to get the FMs to feel an equal in that party.
Thanks, Mark. Chris, I can see you'd like to add something there.
Yeah, just to support what Mark was saying there, I think, to reiterate the points, I don't believe we need the facilities management community to become experts in ESG, and particularly the S of the ESG. There are people out there who do that. There are some fantastic range of organisations, bodies, consultants, etc., that are very focused on this and that really know the industry. What we need to do is understand what we need from that in terms of the outputs of all the great stuff that they're doing. And that's the same across the whole of FM. As I said before, we need to understand what the outputs of those, of what the S is, so that we can be able to make those decisions for the betterment, for the benefit of the communities that we serve. And so that's the key skill, I think.
Well, staying with you, Chris, actually, that's a nice link into my next question, which is really around something that's been talked about in a few responses around the kind of data issue, and I guess using the famous mantra of you can't manage what you can't manage what you don't measure. How is the industry kind of leveraging data to help people actually create these great social buildings? And I suppose in so many instances there's always that challenge of signal to noise, about making sure that we just have a really tight data set that really helps us make great decisions rather than being swamped by data. What's your view on the kind of data and the tools that are out there to help us with this particular theme?
Sure. Yeah, again, a bit of a double-edged sword, because there are some really good tools out there that can help FMs to do that. There isn't a consistent approach to using a coherent set. There isn't an industry standard, if you like, to doing this. And I think there's a reason for that, because it is so diverse. There are so many different elements and criteria that you might need to measure depending on what the scheme, project, building, etc. is. However, I think we are in a better place now than we were perhaps only just a few years ago, that there is advice and tools out there. So the social value portal is one of those. There are others, but that is one of them that have their themes, outcomes and measures, their TOMS process. There are FM plugins for those that actually focus in on specific FM elements of those measures. And so how would you use those? You could use those just on any particular ongoing service or set of services. You can also incorporate them into the procurement piece. And I think the procurement side of things have got a lot to do in this space in terms of focusing in on social value. We know that there is now a need in public sector contracts to focus in on social value, and there are some really good examples actually out there that deliver on that. So a contract has been let, and the social value element of that contract has been this in terms of the social value outcome. But it's not uniform, it's not standard as yet, and I think that is a challenge for us in terms of how we actually cohesively and coherently report on social value. It will come down again to, I'm broken record, but it will come down to whatever the leadership of whatever the specific project, building, etc. is going to mandate in terms of what is important to them. But I think we probably do need to coalesce around the important themes around well-being, in terms of the people that are involved. That I think is a really key aspect, because it has not been focused on very well in the past, and it needs to be focused on more so that social value aspect is really driven home. But in terms of the tools, I think Mark's got some areas that he wants to focus in on the tools, but there are tools out there. From my view of it, I think they're supportive and helpful. I don't think they're uniformly applied as yet.
Thanks, Chris. Well, before I get your thoughts on the tools that you want to talk about, Mark, what's your view on this, Savannah, in terms of the tools and the kind of data points that are really useful and out there for people to use?
Yeah, I think the tools that you should use depends on, and I think Mark made this point earlier, you can't try and do everything. You can't try and do 12 things at once. What are you focusing on? What are the priorities for a particular asset or portfolio? So if it's air quality, you're already focused on the wellness. There's air sorted who are brilliant. I imagine Mark will talk about in more detail. If you already have a lot of different sensor data there, and you want to be able to gather it and then see what you can do for social impact based on that, something like DeepKey can pull from different disparate sources. Or like what my company does is we're focused on more of the occupier satisfaction and well-being tracking. So, you make it very engaging, very dynamic, and like I mentioned earlier, use game mechanics to really empower a community of occupiers to engage with you and share their feedback. And, you make it able to annotate maps of the building, make them able to really, respond in the ways that are accessible for not just the tenant themselves, but all of their end users. And then that's when you then have the analytic and reporting platform, which is to really monitor over time how tenant satisfaction, their expectations, their uses of space, how that's changing, how that's evolving each quarter, so that you can actually see how it's actually also impacting the asset value, your tenant retention. Is that going up and down in association with the tenant satisfaction? What influences this? I think that's where it can get really interesting, is there's almost two sides to it. One is the tools you use to gather the data, and the other one is the tools you then use to analyze it, and that's where you can marry them together. But yeah, that's my big passion at the moment, is really on that side of how do you get the hard to reach people within those buildings to also, you can't know if you're adding social value if you don't ask people. I don't mean to make it, to state the obvious, but you really have to hear from people, and not just from you can't just hear from the people who are signing the lease, because at the end of the day, it's that the reason they're spending that money on your expensive buildings, and I'm talking commercial here rather than residential, is because they're trying to make the people, the end users of that building, happy. That's what it really comes down to, and productive.
Thanks, Vanessa. So, Mark, what's your perspective on the kind of tools that you're using?
Yeah, so just a couple of examples to make it real, really. So in offices, two things. One is, we touched on air quality. I've spent 10 years talking about this, and I'm very lucky I now get to drive it in, but it's very much using air quality as a way to show companies that a space is healthy for their staff. Like, so if you start from the lens of health rather than productivity, I learned that the hard way. I started at productivity, I've come back. COVID taught us that humidity transfers germs, and so does poor ventilation. CO2 is a proxy for ventilation. So actually all these sensors we've now got in the buildings in the UK, you can roll it up into some really nice, which we do with air rated. We sit down with the occupiers and say, right, actually, this is great space for your people and we can prove it. Similarly, double-edged sword, you've got a platinum space where actually there's an energy trade-off there. You could have a certified space and we could all save a lot of energy in this building. Let's have that chat. So that's one thing. Build on Savannah's point, and she knows, I've had this chat a lot over the last year or so, like getting the building users to give us actual feedback as it happens. These QR codes, they have changed our culture beyond. Like, everybody in our buildings knows at any time someone could send a QR code that I see and our asset manager sees. It's an amazing way to keep everyone on their toes. As long as it's not, when I say that, it makes it sound like it's all negative. Actually, 99% of stuff that comes through is reward, and people get vouchers and well dones. So, but the 1% that comes through that's not great, people jump on it because no one wants to be associated with letting somebody down or providing a poor service or whatever it might be. So those two examples, I think, of where we're trying to become more people-centric. And then I've just got to drop a quick retail one in. In Poole, we've got an initiative called Kingland. And that's where we had a load of empty units on the high street, and obviously Poole Council not massively happy about that, nor were we, because we weren't making any rent. We've got 7 or 8 local businesses to start a business, gave them 2 years rent free, and the data we've used to validate that is footfall. So we haven't changed it. The reason I use that example is we didn't come up with a whole load of new metrics. We just said, surely if we do something cool and interesting here, we'll have 7 or 8 businesses that people want to visit. And then, sorry, the other metric we use is average spend per customer. And would you know, 3 years later, footfall's 7 or 8% higher than it was pre-pandemic, and average spend is whatever it is more. So actually, on social value, you don't have to invent loads of new metrics. You just have to be really clear on what you're trying to influence through the social value piece and the people-centric approach. And then it can come back to lease renewals, it can come back to footfall, it can come back to premium rents. But that you don't need new metrics on that. You just need to be clear what it was that drove that outcome. So as long as you can show cause and effect, I think actually a lot of existing metrics can be used.
Thanks, Mark. I'd like to stick with you, Mark, if I may, and ask a question now. We've talked quite a lot, I think, about the real power of getting the community into buildings and how we use buildings as that extension of connecting the community with the normal occupiers. But I'm also intrigued to kind of probe around, you know, the thorny issue of hybrid working, which obviously, you know, firms have different attitudes to that, and many firms, even if they have embraced it, have this concern over, you know, how the workplace culture, engagement and collaboration can still be supported when you don't have the kind of pre-pandemic everybody at their desk 9 to 5 Monday to Friday. And I'm wondering what your thoughts is, particularly around kind of, you know, FM data and technology, how we can actually foster those issues of collaboration and engagement when we have this hybrid world of some people in, some people out, you know, this very, very different atmosphere.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, the easy answer to that is we try and run our offices like hotels now. So the big difference being, and this is my view, has always been that we aren't the occupier themselves. That's their business, their culture. But what we can do is give them, particularly SMEs actually that really latch onto this, is access to teams that can help them attract their staff in, if you like. So Savannah's point, placemaking, amenity, air quality is a good hook. And net zero carbon, being really clear about how we share data and achievement on that. So the theory on that being that hybrid working or not, if you believe as a business you need a hub for people to be in, which I personally do, ignore the Monday, Friday thing, which is interesting to see how that plays out over a 5-year period. I think we're too early to make decisions on that personally. People, when they want to be together, want to be in great space. They want to feel safe. They want to feel secure. They want to be, and the organisation that they work for wants them to feel part of something bigger, right? So our role as a landlord is to support that occupier and what they're trying to create for their staff. Now, you can't do that without communication. It's not technology. It's about relationships. Any organisation in any industry needs to partner with their customers. It's just the real estate industry got that message last, right? We spent years treating leases as financial instruments, and we've now realised that it's a B2B relationship that needs to be fostered. And I think that's where we've got real success in the last couple of years. I actually speak to a lot of these tenants. The reason they chose our business, they felt like Legal & General wanted to partner with them at a business level. And to Savannah's point, there's a separation in how we view the people coming in at the business level as an L&G partner and the building user who thinks, oh, right, I'm now in Apex in Reading, right? We separate the two because actually that's where you get the hotel feel locally, and then you get the B2B type relationship at the top in terms of how we collaborate together. So do you know what? PropTech's helped us in terms of getting accessibility into that B2B layer and sharing information, that lovely stuff, but it's people that feel that they can have those great conversations and they can understand what organizations want. And yeah, lots of big organizations are reducing their footprint, but you know, equally as much as I'm seeing in our portfolio, are increasing it, Andrew. They want good quality space where people can spend good quality time together, so they're having bigger meeting rooms, bigger breakout spaces. It's a really interesting, I genuinely say to people all the time, you need a longer period of time to judge what's happened post-COVID. I think there was a lot of stuff that was judgment was made after a year. And actually that's proven not to be necessarily true.
So Chris, it sounds like it's about obviously being people-centric, but also having great spaces and I guess spaces which people really know how safe, how well performing, how well connected they are, I guess.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think, again, just to support the points Mark was making, I think the advent of technology in our industry, I mean, there are people that say it's been around for years, but particularly in the way in which it's now used and the access to it, you know, the proliferation of it and the access to it, it is supporting those decisions around, well, how do we use space? How should we use space? How do people want to use space? I think that is slightly trickier, but how it actually is being used, I think there is now the ability, the potential ability, depending on investment levels and where the tech is. And of course, it is different across both public and private sectors. So we shouldn't really assume that everyone has access to such technology. But the potential for us to do that in terms of the sector, yeah, that's very much there in terms of then being able to drive that correct decision making about how people want to use space. What I don't think we're likely to see, so just wanted to say, completely agree the fact that we are a bit early to make any real firm decisions post-COVID. We're not there yet. But I don't think we're likely to see, I almost hope we're not likely to see a return to sort of fields and fields of desks and people just sat behind desks Monday to Friday. It's much more collaborative space. It's much more, it certainly is in my business and other businesses like mine, where if you're in the office, you can see that I'm not in the office today, but if you're in the office, then it's because you want to be there, because you want to see people and collaborate with them. I think what is pretty much certain, sticking my neck out a bit, is that people won't necessarily go to the office to sit down and work there for 8 to 10 hours just on their own. That being said, I mentioned that to a user group within my business not too long ago, and I was slightly shot down because some of the younger guys that were coming in saying, well, I can't work at home, so that's the reason I come to the office. Yeah. So I think it is a bit mixed in terms of how or indeed what the decision would be. But just to sort of really focus back on the question just quickly, I think it is about having that real time or near to real time data about how the office space is being used by the people that need to use it that can make those decisions. Because previously we were probably guessing, and I think now we've actually got the data that supports those decisions that need to be made.
Thanks, Chris. So, Savannah, what's your view on the challenge of hybrid working and how we can support it? I think, as both Mark and Chris have said, you know, it hasn't shaken out yet, has it? We don't really know what this is going to fully look like, and also it's not a macro piece. Individuals have different drivers, as you say. Young people probably don't have a spare room, therefore the office for them still has a great role in terms of just the functionality of being able to conduct their role.
Yeah, I mean, I'm much more interested in the office this week because of the AC, to be honest. Never mind the collaboration. I just want to be in an AC machine. But no, I think I completely agree with both what Mark and Chris said. And I think that the only thing I would probably add is I think we can look beyond prop tech as well. I think there's, you know, great technologies out there that have been developed to help with hybrid working, which from, you know, just things like we're talking about, you know, tools like Slack. You know, people are already often on something like Slack, or if you're on Microsoft, they have their own, you know, tools for that, where if you can integrate that in with having a separate channel, essentially more on that facilities management side, coordinating when people are coming into the office, it makes a huge difference. Having those, and I know that's something that comes from the occupier side rather than the landlord or facilities management, but actually, you know, I often decide if I'm going to go in based on, I can see on Slack how many of my team are planning to go in on a Tuesday. and often that will have an impact on whether you go in. And I think there's ways, that's not a prop tech tool. So I think we can actually look beyond as well to see there's other ways of connecting people and bringing them together that can really help. And I think that's also actually, that's where doing social impact initiatives can help drive the footfall in there. I'll go back to what I said before, which is we need to, and I think we all said, we have to tie in social value with commercial objectives. You know, it's just like, you know, in an office context, it's about increasing tenant renewals and market value. That's what you get when you do deliver great social value. In the retail context, like Mark said earlier, it leads to increased footfall and reducing vacancy rates. So when you integrate these things in together, actually, that means that if you use technology to try and, you know, sort of drive engagement with great social value events, you're going to drive that footfall or that usage of your buildings as well.
Well, thanks all of you. Thanks, Savannah. Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Mark. We're at the end of our time. And I guess if there was one phrase to summarize a huge amount of discussion over the last hour, I think I'd almost grab that quote of yours, Savannah, about connecting people. It sounds like great social buildings are about connecting people, both the staff and the community. So all I can say is thank you ever so much for your time, a real pleasure. And hopefully we can continue this conversation on some future date. But it's been fascinating. And thanks very much.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much for having us.
Thank you.